Good morning. Welcome to the second day of our conference, What is Nature and Human Nature? It's a pleasure to see you again. We are starting now with the first panel, Bioanalysis and Biology, with Herman Westerink, Jenny Willner, Sam Adriansen, and Raluca Zorenau as the next lecturer. The panel will last around 90 minutes, and afterwards there will be a coffee break. And then the next panel will start. Hello. So I will just briefly introduce our moderator and then pass the floor to you. So Sam Adriansen here is working currently on his PhD project, which is centering around Rajna Khanna's Dark Continents and Freud's Mourning and Melancholia and Moses and Monotheism. He has a background in engineering, psychology, and philosophy. And besides his PhD studies, he currently also works at the Dutch Research Council, and also he is a program officer for the Hestia grant. This is a grant providing academic opportunities for refugees. Thank you all. We are looking forward to your contribution. And Jenny, Herman, Sam, it's up to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very glad that I can introduce these two speakers today. The first one is Jenny Willner. She's a professor for the comparative literature at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. She has written several works on Freud and Ferenczi and has co-authored the book Ferenczi Dialogues on Trauma and Catastrophe with Raluca Zorenau, our next speaker in this panel, and Jacob Staberg. She also co-edited the volume Towards the Limits of Freudian Thinking, critical edition and readings of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, together with Herman Westerink and Philipp van Houten. In 2024, she completed her habilitation, Unbehagen am Erbe, which discusses Freud and Ferenczi's bioanalysis. Our second speaker is Herman Westerink. He's endowed professor and associate professor for philosophy and religion at the Center for Contemporary European Philosophy at the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. He has published many books and articles on Freudian psychoanalysis, sexuality, subjectivity, and religion. Amongst others, he published a monograph on Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality with Philipp van Houten. He published a monograph on Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, and recently he published a monograph on Freud's Metaphysics on Trauma. In the talks yesterday, there were some reference already to Beyond the Pleasure Principle and to Ferenczi, so I'm really interested how this next talk will follow up. And in their talk, they will inquire into Freud's biological references in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud's Bio-Analytical project. So I give you the floor.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind introduction. Okay. Should I start again? Okay. Thank you, Sam. That we, Jenny and I, present a contribution to the conference together reflects our fascination for the Bio-Analytical project Freud and Ferenczi started around 1915, and that culminated in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle and Ferenczi's Thalassa. When fascinations meet, beautiful things happen. We edited a critical edition of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It's on display, and several commentaries to that text in a volume with the title Towards the Limits of Freudian Thinking, and was published last year. This book project was initiated by Philipp van Houten and myself in 2021, about a year before Philipp sadly passed away. Philipp and I have been working together since 2013 on the various editions of Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality that do not so much reflect a progressive development of theory, but much more increasing inconsistencies and tensions within the text. In the later editions of Free Essays in particular, Freud is also struggling with the integration of new theoretical insights into the text, amongst others the new drive theory introduced in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Our last joint project, some already referred to it, on Freud's trauma theory and its development from the seduction theory into a theory in which the human physiological and psychical constitution is thought as the result of trauma and the subsequent acquisitions of characteristics, gave us the opportunity to systematically explore Beyond the Pleasure Principle as a contribution to trauma theory. Is Beyond the Pleasure Principle indeed a contribution to trauma theory, one might want to ask. Again, we were confronted with various editions, a text written in 2 periods, separated by a year between early 1919, a first version, and then editions, important editions, in the summer of 1920. And a text in which Freud seems to critically respond with his concepts of life and death drives to his speculations on trauma, repetition, and the conservative character of all drives in the earlier written text parts. Again, a text full of inconsistencies and tensions, and in the midst of this, the many references to different evolutionary and biological theories that together can be situated in a larger context of debates on the fundamental principles that define life and death, and that define change, progress, purposefulness, and the finality in and of living substances.
When Philippe passed away in November 2022, I had been a member of the Freud research group founded by Philippe and Herman for about 2 years. My own background is in literary theory, so I joined this enriching Freud research group, departing from my own research on the biological speculation and the work of Freud and Ferenczi. The question of this conference, what is nature in human nature, brings up an equivalent question at the level of discourse analysis. What is biology in psychoanalysis? A thought that I have tried to develop systematically in a series of articles and book chapters over the past 5 years is that the biological speculation, for instance in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is not a form of reductionist biologism, but rather a critical reworking of biological thought, an experimental reinvention of biology. In reading Lamarck, Haeckel, Bölsche, or Weismann, Freud and Ferenczi insert the psychoanalytic paradigms of traumatic neurosis and hysteria into the concepts and narratives of organic life. So this was where I came from at the beginning of this dialogue, which then led to me joining Herman in wrapping up the book project he had developed together with Philippe. The goal of reconstructing the different text versions of Beyond the Pleasure Principle in this book, the goal was never to gain a systematic, coherent, or consistent theory of the drives. It was actually quite the opposite. Acknowledging the different versions of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, above all highlights that there is something episodic, fragmentary, unfinished with this text. It is explorative. Freud produces a range of ideas and experiments with different trajectories. Even the final version, as authorized by Freud, doesn't present a coherent system of thought. Today we want to continue to discuss this text, and we started by breaking down our co-written introduction into a dialogical format, into fragments, so to say. We want to highlight the contradictions even more, also where our respective readings of Beyond the Pleasure Principle differ. Freud ends Beyond the Pleasure Principle with a quote saying, "What we cannot reach flying, we must reach limping. The book tells us it is no sin to limp," and we will continue in this sense.
I must laugh because we were limping our way up to the back.
Yes, we have back problems and it's difficult to walk. We limped all the way here. We take our research very seriously.
We take it very serious. We've developed hysterical symptoms. Beyond the Pleasure Principle is likely the most commented of Freud's text in philosophical literature. Notably, the puzzling and intriguing concept of the death drive, even though Freud here only uses the plural, death drives, has been at the center of reflections. This is no surprise. After all, this text has, ever since its publication in 1920, been recognized as the zenith of Freud's metapsychology. Here, Freud dares to think beyond the limits of his own clinical practice and beyond the theoretical shibboleths of psychoanalysis.
In the title of our volume, Towards the Limits of Freudian Thinking, the notion of limits stands in relation to the beyond of the pleasure principle. Looking back at the First World War, Freud challenged the assumption that all neuroses are related to sexuality. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud addresses the question of trauma, which had been lingering in the backgrounds since he allegedly abandoned the theory of seduction. It was the recurring nightmares of shell-shocked soldiers that forced him to question his theory of the dream as a wish fulfillment. We speak of the limits of Freudian thinking because Freud addresses the limits of his founding theoretical principles and also the limits of clinical practice. It touches upon the question whether severely traumatized patients can ever be successfully treated.
In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud approaches the limits of psychoanalysis in yet another sense, while reconsidering the notions of drive, repetition, trauma, and pleasure. He registers, not without concern, that through these speculations, by approaching the last questions of life and death, he has unwittingly steered his course, in what he says, into the harbor of Schopenhauer's philosophy. In fact, he had steered into the harbor of a whole history of Western metaphysics. And yet, despite some references to Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, he is far from seeking to systematically clarify the relation between psychoanalysis and philosophy. In terms of steering into different harbors, the striking feature of Beyond the Pleasure Principle is not the use of philosophical terms and concepts, but rather the many references to evolutionary biology and physiology, physics. When Freud speaks of far-fetched speculations pertaining to the origins and development of organic life, he seems to be announcing that he is about to abandon the realm of his own discipline towards an inquiry into the mechanical, chemical, somatic sources of the drives beyond the scope of psychoanalysis and its clinical observations.
Indeed, Freud's text invites us to reflect whether biology and physics are the beyond of psychoanalysis. Do they go beyond the scope of this discipline, or do they rather form the basis of psychoanalysis as a materialist foundation? Frank Soloway, a historian of science, famously claimed that Freud, by engaging a set of outdated scientific theories, sought to provide his own theoretical edifice with a solid ground. And Soloway didn't see this in a very positive light. But the biological references in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, we would argue, do not point towards any coherent set of theories, and Freud knows this. He speculates on biology, knowing that this discourse does not form anything resembling a solid basis for his metapsychological speculations. Throughout the versions of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he refers to different and often mutually opposing biological theories. Against this background, his own statement that, quote, biology truly is a land of unlimited possibilities refers less to the status of his own biological references and rather to a hypothetical biology of the future which, as Freud writes, may blow away the whole of our artificial structure of hypothesis. Dimensions of beyond. Freud dwells in the gray zones of his theory. Hence, the beyond is perhaps to be sought for less outside and rather at the center of the psychoanalytic edifice. In 1915, Freud defined the drive as a concept, quote, on the frontier of the mental and the somatic. And surely this definition could be applied to psychoanalysis itself, operating on the frontier of the mental and the somatic, exploring symptoms, formulating principles that structure the psychic life of embodied creatures. And yet it cannot be denied that Freud speculates far beyond the specific discourse founded by himself. By engaging with resolutely material issues, he extends his own theory to encompass the entire natural world. He speculatively applies psychoanalytic theory to the fundamental reality of all organic life. The word beyond, in German jenseits, can also lead our thoughts to the question of life after death. And indeed, the relation between life and death occupies a central position in this text. And Freud does not connect the question of a beyond with theology, but rather with natural scientific debates. What is life, scientifically speaking? Where does it begin? Where does it end? What is at stake with this question is also the unstable relation between biology and chemistry or physics, biology versus the sciences of what no longer belongs to the realm of bios, inorganic matter, lifeless structures, and the machine-like laws of physicalism. Where does biology begin? Where does it end? Even today, the disciplinary limits of biology, linked to the precise moment at which organic life emerges from lifeless chemical structures of protein, the questions of this limit remains heavily debated within the natural sciences. But speaking in terms of 19th century history of science, Freud's engagement with these questions touches upon the old conflict between natural philosophic vitalism and mechanistic physicalism, two opposing paradigms with which Freud was more than familiar from working in the laboratories of both Karl Klaus and Ernst Brücke as a young neurologist. But what do we make of all this? I would tend to say that there is no vitalism in Freud's speculation on the primitive cell. But this is a difficult, controversial question, and we will return to this question later.
Freud's speculations on the first defensive differentiations on the surface of the former undifferentiated vesicle are part of the first version of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Here, Freud explores the puzzling question as to why the shell-shocked traumatic neurotic patients compulsively repeat traumatic situations that were never and will never be pleasurable. How to understand such repetitions? They appear to give evidence of characteristics of the drives, those demonic forces that constantly pressure organic life forms from within, insisting on the blind continuation of their own movement, repetition for the sake of repetition. But they also point towards a more functional, reactive repetition, a kind of exercise, a task that needs to be fulfilled. The organism that seeks to protect itself from the modifying, life-threatening forces that bombard the vesicle, just like the shell-shocked patients, maybe only repeat in order to be able to erect the first defensive measures against the paralyzing influx of drive energy. The repetitions would serve the task of transforming fright into anxiety as a first protective shield, a shield that turns the immediate suddenness into the expectation of a danger approaching. Anxiety provides the first orientation and differentiation in time and space, danger approaching, objects appearing, calculations and structuring of reality. Is the vesicle merely a metaphor for understanding the first defensive shields and restart of psychic life in the traumatic neuroses? Or is it Freud's, as Habermas would say, scientific self-misunderstanding to found psychoanalysis on evolutionary theory? Or is it the other way around? And do we find here the bioanalytic implications of Freud's patho-analytic perspective of human psychic life? If the psychopathologies inform us about general human psychic principles, tendencies, and structures, why not assume that they also inform us about the principles that define all organic life? It goes without saying that Freud's relation to the medical and natural sciences of his time has been subject to conflicting interpretations within both the psychoanalytic and the philosophical reception of his theory. His references to biology and physics were for a long time deemed highly problematic as obstructing the reflection on the text's fundamental conceptuality. Without exploring this further, the dominant reaction from the publication of Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920 was already fairly critical to the way Freud had introduced a new drive conceptuality from biological and evolutionary speculations. The reactions from people like Karen Horney and Wilhelm Reich onwards is to turn attention to the neurotic conflict in relation to cultural life. And one may want to add that Freud follows the same trajectory in his later writings and turns attention away from the evolution of organic life towards the drives as they manifest themselves in culture and its discontents. Maybe Beyond the Pleasure Principle proved a dead-end street. And yet, over the years, several different lines and reception have sought a possible retour of Freud, less negligent regarding the body and the organic. This can, on the one hand, be seen as part of a more general move away from the linguistic turn in contemporary continental philosophy. On the other hand, similar tendencies are already inherent in so-called post-structuralism, where Lacan's impact can be traced even in the works of his critics. Deleuze and Guattari, for example, speak of human beings as desiring machines, that is, as organic psychic apparatuses, forms and functions, relations and expressions of a productive force acting from within. They seem at first glance to be in line with Freud's view of the life drives as an energy which sets both the body and the psychic apparatus in motion from within and produces ever new forms.
Within the younger paradigm of new materialism, Elizabeth Wilson has put forward the thesis that Freud becomes relevant for contemporary critical theory precisely where he refers to biology and physiology. Wilson argues that the psychoanalytic engagement with biology is relevant to a feminist theory of embodiment. So she criticizes the bias against biologism and argues that Freud's and Ferenczi's biological speculation can help us understand how the domains of the biogenetic and the psychocultural are, as she says, materially intertwined. I am somewhat skeptical towards some aspects of this approach, where the linguistic turn is deemed obsolete, as if we suddenly had a transparent language at our disposal to represent the organic. Both Freud and Ferenczi explicitly reflect that there is no transparent, there is no neutral language of science. And I would argue that this reflection remains crucial for the relation between psychoanalysis and biology. And it doesn't necessarily imply that all references to biology can be replaced by reflections on the signifier. Regarding these questions, a different line of inquiry has emerged from Jacques Derrida's reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle in his posthumously published lecture series, Life, Death. Indeed, Derrida's interest in the natural sciences is strongly linked to his engagements with Freud. Reading Freud with Derrida and Derrida with Freud shows that there is something proto-deconstructivist in Freud's speculation about material issues. Francesco Vitale speaks of a bio-deconstruction. Beyond the Pleasure Principle offers a radical way of thinking biological life as constitutively inscribed by death. The death drives are not just about death, they structure life as we know it. And the life drives, since they enforce dissolution, are deadly for the individual.
We think that Freud's references to biology can neither be replaced by symbolic structures, nor do they obstruct philosophical reflection. They enforce it. Regarding biology and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, we argue that questions pertaining to fundamental conceptualities lie at the core of the subject matter at stake, of the specific notions of organic and inorganic matter, and of the principles and dynamics that structure life. For philologically inclined readers, this raises a set of pragmatic questions regarding the genealogy of the biological speculations in the text, in view of Freud's earlier writings on both physics and biology, for instance in the Project for a Scientific Psychology. How and why does a clinical practice focused on the narratives and verbal associations of patients engender a theory that seems to culminate in reflections on the nature of organic life and the status of the inanimate? In other words, where and why did the itinerary that made Freud steer into the harbor of metaphysics start? One could argue that it began with Freud in the late 1890s, questioned the exclusive role of accidental factors in the etiology of the psychoneuroses. He saw himself forced to, again, deal with the question of the constitutional and hereditary factors. He had previously distanced himself from these issues, the hereditary etiology of the neuroses, which remained the most important and common interpretive scheme available at his time. The status of constitution and heredity remains an open problem to which Freud never ceases to return from different angles, handling it in ambivalent ways, partly as an alien body, beyond the scope of psychoanalytic theory, but also suggesting its founding status within a post-Darwinian anthropology. Freud does not seem to be willing to leave the question of heredity and constitution to the prevailing neuropsychiatric discourses on degeneration. By means of his biological speculations, he continues to explore this territory.
The biological speculation and beyond the pleasure principle is linked to questions of both heredity and of inheritance. Speaking of inheritance, in terms of a scientific historical heritage or legacy, we may ask, what precisely does psychoanalysis inherit from the realm of natural sciences and medicine? At a quite different level, we may speak of the question of biological heredity. What do embodied individuals carry with them from former generations? During Freud's lifetime, as Herman already mentioned, this discourse was dominated by certain concepts of evolution and degeneration, which became crucial for racial hygiene, following the phantasm of protecting the national body from alleged hereditary burdens. Freud's view on hereditary and constitutional factors radically differs from this dominating discourse, beginning with the fact that Freud destabilizes the binary of normality and pathology or perversion. In Freud, the origin is never pure, and this undermines the idea of degeneration as a theory of gradual decline, decay, and deterioration of the healthy. While Freud does seek the essential nature of sexuality, as he writes, in somatic processes, the whole point lies in his insistence that these processes are to be understood as constitutively polymorphous. He declares, quote, a general neuropathic disposition to be the sexual constitution. The neuropathic disposition is, in other words, not seen as affecting certain population groups considered particularly prone to degeneration, but it is understood as constitutively human.
From the 3 essays onwards, Freud took his next steps, sometimes inspired by and sometimes in opposition to his closest followers. He engaged with both academically accepted and abandoned, both with dominant and eccentric theories of evolution, from embryology to paleontology and zoology, as well as with the physicalist paradigm of his time. Regarding the status of phylogenetic inheritance, it is worth noting that Freud's application of the models from one discourse to another goes in both directions. Not only does Freud apply his version of phylogenetics to case studies and works of cultural criticism, often enough his reformulation of biological heredity also proceeds in the other direction, from clinical case material via psychoanalytic concepts into the discourse of phylogenetics. According to Freud, constitutional and hereditary factors should be seen as the result of a long series of physiological and psychological modifications and adaptations under the influence of external and internal forces. In Totem and Taboo, the case of the Wolfman, and notably also in a phylogenetic fantasy, the overview of the transference neuroses, Freud argues that the human constitution is the result of evolutionary and cultural historical developments in which traumatic experiences and impressions in the primordial past have left indelible somatic and psychological traces.
The idea of a phylogenetic past of the species haunts Beyond the Pleasure Principle too, the life of the individual repeating the life of the species. According to the cultural theorist Sándor Ferenczi, there is a specific historical reason why Freud preferred to locate the trauma in such a speculative phylogenetic past. It was a way of circumventing the neuropsychiatric theories of the time, according to which neurosis and hysteria were specific degenerative conditions typical for Eastern European Jews, who were assumed to be irreversibly marked by the hereditary consequences of diaspora and ghettoization. Freud's universalization of the trauma goes much further back to a phylogenetic past long before any of the currently existing cultural or ethnic groups emerged. What was deemed typically Eastern Jewish then appears as something proto-human. The very aberrations, the very lack which the mainstream tends to project onto certain individuals is placed into the center of the notion of life itself. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud understands both the variety of the species and the innumerable individual variations as the result of shocks in the past, of past catastrophes on Earth. The structure of the drive constitution appears as the result of a series of traumatic events that have shaped the history of all organisms. In this way, Freud combines phenomena faced in clinical practice with speculations on the history of organic life.
In this way, trauma and drive become key concepts in Freud's metapsychology and tragic view of human life. And Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he explores and speculates on the relation between the two. Are the drives aimed at change and development, perhaps even at perfection? A first answer is that, on the contrary, the drives aim to restore a past state that was abandoned due to the disturbing traumatic forces. The drives are characterized by a manifest compulsion to repeat, aiming to restore, at any cost, a previous inanimate state, to return to the inorganic. With the introduction of the life drives, eros, and death drives, Freud appears to radicalize this perspective. He insists that the life drives, too, are regressive. They are spontaneously aimed at forming larger units, bringing back not inorganic states, but earlier states of the living substance. Freud seems to suggest that this development occurs even though the life drives, strictly speaking, do not aim for progress. A double setup of regressive aims paradoxically generates more differentiated and increasingly complex life forms. Developments seems to appear as a secondary effect, that is, as the result of life drives seeking to unite or reunite parts, and the death drives aiming at dissolving these units. And yet, one could also argue that in Freud's own words, the life drives are a substitute for that what he previously rejected and still rejects as drive towards perfection. With the concept of the life drives, Freud indeed rejects purposefulness or finality of the drives. But he now affirms that there is a factor in the drives impelling towards change and development and the production of new forms independent of external circumstances. Following Weismann, coalescences of cells and bodies are the motive forces in the evolution of the variety of species and individuals. Freud is well aware that the introduction of the concept of the life drives also brings him closer to Jung's vitalistic theory of the libido. Maybe Ferenczi is right when he suggests that Freud's concept of the life drives comes close to Bergson's élan vital. After all, the main characteristics of the life drives as urges towards assimilation, growth, multiplication, and variation, according to Ferenczi, only seem to differ from the élan vital because of their traumatic origin. Both the life drives and the élan vital are energetic concepts in a theory in which development and growth do not equal purposefulness and predetermined telos. Is there thus a sort of vitalism in Freud's new drive theory? The death drives point, probably, in a different direction, but we should note that in the context of the new drive theory, the references to trauma, repetition, and inheritance of acquired characteristics largely disappear. Instead, Freud turns attention to something else, aggression, and the active engagement of a living being with the surrounding objects. Not trauma, but aggression now defines the tragic character of life. This reflects the idea that not all drives seek the elimination of tension produced by external factors. There are drives that produce excitation and tension that cannot be functionalized and need to be diverted and directed towards external objects, hence the problem of aggression.
The question of vitalism, linked to the question whether the life drives in Beyond the Pleasure Principle urge towards growth, is actually where our respecting readings differ. In our introduction, which the two of us otherwise wrote very smoothly, we kept editing the text back and forth at this very point. And in a way, we realized later, we ended up in a kind of compromise formation, hiding both Herman's reading and my own. So we thought, let's do a showdown now. Let's break it all apart.
This is what we draw guns.
So while Herman just said that the life drives only differ from the élan vital because of their traumatic origin, I would not necessarily disagree, but I would definitely put the emphasis differently. This difference is enormous. And yes, Freud reads Weismann, but while Weismann focuses on the immortality of the germline in a kind of reproductive futurist sense, Freud is more interested in the dissolution of the parental cells, in their death, which for Weismann is ein nebensächliches Anhängsel. So this regressive dissolution is, according to Freud, what the eros aims for. That procreation happens is because once upon a time there was a coincidence. And he always repeats the word zufällig, an event that since then has been compulsively repeated. In other words, Freud's life drives may result in procreation, growth, and so-called higher development, but they do not aim for it. Freud's primitive cell does not appear as a Jungian aufstrebender Keim, and it definitely lacks the spirit of a Siegfried der Drachentöter. It is conceived of as an utterly traumatized neurotic. So it is retelling evolution as if the first cell was already neurotic, in a way. But we can return to common ground. Freud immersed himself in biology precisely between the 1919 and the 1920 versions of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he did so within the framework of his cooperation with the Hungarian analyst Sándor Ferenczi. They were planning a book which they never wrote, but it was supposed to develop a new science, bioanalysis. And Beyond the Pleasure Principle is, among other things, part of this project. Freud attempts to apply the metapsychology of the psychic apparatus on organic life. In other words, if we read Beyond the Pleasure Principle bioanalytically, then the biology of the primitive cell is not the model for Freud's speculation, but the other way around. Freud uses his metapsychology of the psychic apparatus in order to re-signify the primitive cell. And now the floor is open to further discuss what this may mean, or whatever you may have as questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich talk. It keeps amazing me how every time you read Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it always opens new avenues, especially when it's read so insightful as you did. So I suppose there will be some questions, perhaps. If not, oh, can you pass the microphone, please? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks indeed. Very fascinating talk. My question is a bit more broad, I think, but as both of you emphasized, there are also many opposing or perhaps contradictory biological theories in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And I was just curious, what do you make of that? Because I think especially people who are not into psychoanalysis often criticize Freud for being very contradictory. And of course, for people into psychoanalysis, contradiction is very important. But when I was reading Beyond the Pleasure Principle, I also struggled a bit also with my own lack of knowledge on biology, but also indeed these contradicting biological theories. So I was just curious if you could elaborate a bit on how you see that contradiction.
Mm.
Do you want to start?
I will, yes. It's a complicated question. And in the answer, I would... Yesterday already we spoke about this, I think the reference to Charcot's obituary, this idea of the different perspectives, the different observations that also lead to different metapsychological theories and constructs. And this is something that you see often in Freud's work, also within writings of them on their own, like Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So this is a first element, I think, this idea that from different and often clinical perspectives, different questions can be raised and different speculations and constructs follow. And they can be related to biological theories, like in the first edition of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in particular, Haeckel's biogenetic law, Lamarck's theory of the acquisition of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, etc. And maybe from other observations, clinical or not, different perspectives enter the scene. At the same time, there is this intriguing, having said this, there is this intriguing passage in the statement where he says biology is the land of unlimited possibilities. So it is also within a landscape, in the biological literature on the fundamental concepts of biology, there is a space, so to speak, certainly between the poles of radical mechanistic approaches and radical vitalistic approaches, that creates a space for Freud to use, so to speak, and explore the potentials of different positions in biology and evolutionary theory, and more or less to play with that also. You could also say it's cherry picking at certain moments, but it's more and more serious than that. So this is the first part of an answer, I think.
Mm. And the second part of an answer would be that in the entire text, he admits that he moves to a place where we cannot know, and then he asks, can we find a proof in biology? And then he goes through all these different theories and comes out on the other end, oh, we do not have an answer. And that's like he's staying in that state in a way. For instance, is death inherently necessary to organic matter, or is it an accident that perhaps practically unavoidable, in an unavoidable way happens and happens again? No idea. And it is also funny because, I mean, Lamarck is, of course, always present with the idea of inherited characteristics, and Haeckel as well with the word protist, which is a Haeckelian term for the first, Ulrike mentioned that yesterday as well, for the first cell. And at the same time, Beyond the Pleasure Principle goes against the very Weltanschauung that is inherent to Haeckel's biology, the idea that there is a progress in nature. So I would say that is a common denominator between the different biological concepts that Freud draws upon, that while they look into the future and upwards, he takes it and looks in the other direction, like Lamarckism, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, is basically what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and if the giraffe stretches its neck, it becomes better and better and better. But in Freud and Ferenczi's use of Lamarckism, it is a very strange Lamarckism. It is more like the inheritance of neurotic reactions to trauma are passed on, not the achievements, not the goals. and that is a very, very strange Lamarckism indeed, just as it is very, very strange to read Weismann, as I believe, with Spielrein, Destruction als Ursache des Werdens. It is a very, very queer way in which he reads these different opposing paradigms.
Mm-hmm. May I add just one thing that strikes me now? Freud's strange intuitions about the relation between life and death and the sequence. So you already mentioned the problem of the acquisition of characteristics. The whole discussion in chapter 6 of the text on whether death is acquired in the course of evolution, whereas Freud has a very counterintuitive idea about the relation between death and life. Death precedes life. Death does not come after life. Death is the original state. That's very counterintuitive, and it has no an analogy, if you want. It has no parallel in biological discourse or biological theory. Things from the idea that you have life and something dies. And so there is this very interesting tension also between Freud and a body of literature, where at that point he says, there's nothing in biological theory that contradicts my ideas about relation between life and death, so I proceed.
One thing a very small thing that I would say, I mean, two opposing paradigms are, of course, neo-Darwinism, which would be Weismann, and Lamarckism and neo-Lamarckism. They are opposing paradigms. But over the last years, I always used the question, is this compatible with racial hygiene and eugenicist thought? And within that body, you will find both neo-Darwinists and Lamarckists. And I think that what Freud does is rethinking biology in a way that is not compatible with eugenicist thought and degeneration. And I've had that as like my hypothesis of reading, and I still haven't I'm waiting, I mean, I still haven't found a reason not to think that this is an important criterion, whether it was intended that way or not, but I'm astonished at the fact that I actually always find it confirmed that the intervention goes into a direction which is not compatible with that kind of idea of a biological optimization and degeneration. Our answers are too long. We need to answer shorter to get more questions.
Could you pass? Yeah, thank you. Oh, that's also good. Marlene? Oh.
Thank you. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, thank you. Coming from gender studies and also literary studies, I found it always very suggestive what feminist new materialism does. But then at the end, we are at the same level like yesterday. It's always thinking in analogies, which are very intriguing, but there's no following step. So I was wondering, maybe could it be that Freud wrote or was discussing all these different theories just to throw out a bait to scientists? Is it more thought as a dialogue and to an offer to biologists? And is there any indication that he was indeed trying to open a dialogue with scientists?
Well, yes. I think the entire bio-analytical project, which was a project Freud and Ferenczi engaged with between 1914 and 24, roundabout, or 13 and 24, followed up on this idea, but they never entered the dialogue, or I don't know. I read this project, which was never finished, as an idea of truly intervening. And Ferenczi was more explicit with these things than Freud. He said, we have a gift, for biology. We have something to give. And that is the notion of overdetermination. But I just think the natural sciences didn't want that gift. And it is the gift of the notion of overdetermination.
They have no need to take.
Yeah, but perhaps they do. I mean, that would be also a poetology of sciences. We need to reflect that there is no transparent language in which to talk about organic life, that there is always like an Überschuss. There is always, there is no neutral, ideologically neutral way to speak of organic life, because language comes in between. And I really think that this matters. And I was thinking about this also after Ulrike Kistner's talk and the thing with bacteriology. I mean, when you read Charcot's lectures and Freud's translator comments in the footnotes of it, he always intervenes where Charcot draws the conclusion that it is degeneration, and then either it is a bacteria or a trauma is sort of a way to ward off the degenerational interpretation of it. So it is like a kind of discourse political intervention into biology where it becomes political.
Could we pass the microphone to the front, please?
Thank you both very much. I especially enjoyed the dialogic presentation. I found that very effective, and it's probably one of the reasons why I'm thinking of the clinical situation and wondering what you think about the implications for treatment of the notion of a bio-analytical project. Reflecting on the transformation of psychoanalytic practice by the advent half a century ago of psychopharmacology and the way that's transformed the diagnostics and the phenomenology of the consulting room and the analytic dialogue. Thinking of the somewhat more recent emergence of the field of neuropsychoanalysis and the potential implications of that conjunction for treatment and differential diagnosis. I wonder, if you have thoughts about what might go beyond psychopharmacology and neuropsychoanalysis in terms of a bioanalytical practice of psychoanalysis.
I've never thought about that. It's a good question.
Well,
we're both not being analysts.
We're both not analysts. We don't treat patients. We have no experience with that. So
difficult to answer.
Yes, I hesitate to answer that. Yes, I think it wouldn't be responsible for me to throw out those.
Could you say something about what Freud might have anticipated about the Freud and Ferenczi might have anticipated about the bioanalysis?
I mean, I think this is something we could wonderfully. I mean, this is what Raluca Soriano, who will be our next speaker, always talks about. And we co-wrote this book about Ferenczi together, and she always says, wow, what you are working on is very interesting clinically. And I'm like, that's exciting. I have no idea why. Yeah.
Well, I think there is, back to Freud and the clinical problems on the table, also in the Bio-Analytic project with Ferenczi. I think their main interest might have been hysteria and the traumatic neuroses, and forced the problem, the kind of the clinical phenomenon where you could say the body takes over from the psychic apparatus, there where the psychic apparatus does no longer function, or what Ferenczi would say where the ego stops to think, the body starts to think. I think it is there that their bioanalytical project has a clinical relevance in thinking symptomatology, but more than that, the way that the body can react and respond and also take action in a certain sense of its own. And there are other clinical examples. Elizabeth Wilson is one who explored this in relation to the problem of eating disorders, for example. There are probably other phenomena as well that touch upon this issue. So that would be.
And perhaps, I mean, this of course touches upon the question, why psychoanalysis at all? I mean, the current discourse, we have it very strongly also over social media that you can detect ADHD, you can detect being on the spectrum. I guess we all get flooded with these things, these catalogs of symptoms, perhaps we have this, perhaps we have that disorder, or all the way through in the families. And that is, of course, a discourse that suggests that we don't need to discuss the meaning of symptoms. We don't need to think about language and culture and, of course, of external factors. So I think, in a way, I mean, if you read Freud's case studies, for instance, Little Hans, the emphasis with which he says, this child is not a degenerate, that is what they all would say, but he is not. It is sort of insisting. I think the Bio-Analytical project is in a way also part of this general tendency that even if it is about something that is somatic, even if it has a hereditary background which can be discussed, it doesn't make the discussion of meaning and of the symbolic obsolete, in the opposite. And this is also something where I think Derrida in Archive Image Text, he also wrote about the phylogenetic aspect in Freud and the biogenetic law, and said, no, we should not just, I mean, there is a Lacanian tradition of saying, okay, Freud did this because he didn't have a notion of the signifier, so we'll just replace it with a Lacanian notion of the signifier and then we'll forget it. And Derrida says, no, that's not enough. We perhaps have to bear the thought that we are subjected to a biological archive in an analogous sense in which we are subjected to a cultural, linguistic, symbolic archive. And that this thought, and of course then again we end in analogies in a way, but Ferenczi is also the one who says, oh, we need analogies, and he calls it utricism. What Markus Köhlen yesterday said, in the scientific discourse you would say this is unscientific to think in analogies, and he sort of said, okay, we'll make just this point. We need an analogy from a sphere that is as far away as possible from the one that we are discussing, just to work with this contrast. And it is a way of thinking in parallels and in constellations, in a way, of dynamizing the discourse by doing that.
Maybe first in the front and then later backwards. Thank you.
So, thank you. So, a very nice lecture of both. I have a question. I don't know how to put it correctly, but I guess I have some problems with the reference to Bergson here. So, isn't it true that what Freud, in my opinion, is doing is to stay away from any metaphysical explanation? So, at the end, there we have a principle which is called life, and which, in fact, what Bergson, to put it very quickly, is doing. And what was at the time very popular, so vitalism, as you're referring to. So, but I think Freud is doing completely something else, and I think the kernel is here that Freud is thinking from the unconscious. So we do not know what drives us, but what we have is drives. And we have to work with that. We have to talk with the patient, but it is not a kind of a science or a metaphysics that explains exactly what is happening. So what modern psychology is, as DSM-5, etc., is doing. So I think this élan vital is so far from what Freud is doing. And yeah, can you elaborate on that? So, and one thought I'm also impressed by a book, I don't know whether you know it, of Michel Henry, Généalogie de la psychanalyse. And here is also criticizing this idea of the élan vital of Bergson as a kind of scientific, metaphysical principle. Mm-hmm. And he's also criticizing here Freud, but he praises also Freud for there is something which is just life, and life is experience. And it is not something scientifical. It's not something that it's something which is quite dynamic, so to say. So it's not really a question, but I think, because you mentioned it very shortly, so this reference to Bergson.
Yeah, I mentioned it shortly, and thank you for the question. I hear your question basically also as a question about the limits of Freudian thinking. Yeah. So where does psychoanalytic thinking begin? Where does it end? Where does it accept a certain limit to its own theory and to its own speculations and constructs? And I think our attempt here was to show that beyond the pleasure principle is stretching the limits of Freudian thinking, exactly beyond the point where you would say this is where we should stop. We're talking about experiences, we talk about the unconscious, and this is as far as we can go.
Yeah.
And this is already beyond what we can go, because the unconscious is the unconscious, right? And so, but I really think that we really think that in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud does, this is part of the Bio-Analytic project, go beyond those limits of the experience in the clinical setting or the notion of the unconscious into what defines the fundamental forces of organic life. In that sense, and in that sense, he is right, he does steer into the harbor also of a metaphysical tradition with Schopenhauer that can be traced back all the way back to Aristotle and thinking. And the Aristotle reference is not that strange to make, because Hans Driesch, the most important vitalist in Germany at the moment, was a clearly Aristotelian thinker, and Jung can also be related to that kind of notion of the realization of actualities, etc. And Freud is emerging in that field about the fundamental concepts that are debated in the biological and evolutionary theory, and does try to indeed speculate, and I would say in the end it's metaphysics, about the fundamental forces that define life beyond this usual conceptuality of experiences, observations, and even the notion of the unconscious. Whether he comes close to Bergson, I think there's no time enough to explore this issue here in full length.
Just a short addition, because this question, I mean, it touches upon exactly the place I mentioned in the introduction, where we kept editing back and forth, precisely because, I mean, the Ferenczi passage Herman referred to, there Ferenczi writes, we need to focus on the trauma in order to avoid the danger of arriving at Bergson.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
You tend to emphasize that there is an affinity there. There is a reason that we need to avoid the danger. The concepts are close. And I tend to emphasize the difference matters a lot. I think we get signs from the back that we have probably exceeded gone beyond the limits of our slide.
Maybe we can just do one more quite short question, and with an eye on the time.
I can try and be short. I can't promise. It was a wonderful talk. One of the things I really appreciated is the fact that it is complex, and Freud is always changing his mind. And that's what he offers us, not to land on something we're sure of. He questions it, he turns it over, he revises his theories constantly, even when they are in conflict. So thank you. One thought I had was about starting with death, not life. I think it's because he's interested in state change.
What?
State change. And so from that point of view, you start with death, because life changes the state and then changes it again to death. And so that becomes important in terms of doing the clinical work. Somebody comes in and you say, so when did you start feeling this way? When did the state change? So it's very applicable clinically. I'm also terribly interested in your thoughts about the following. It seems to me that Freud and Ferenczi come together around trauma, and that's exactly where they're going to cross paths and diverge by the end, as we know. So instead of just calling this, what I'm about to say, Nachtraglichkeit, do you see places that they are diverging in this bioanalysis? Do you see the seeds of what will come? I'm curious. I want to say one last thing. The thing I'm thinking in my own mind is reading both of their works after World War I about the war. Freud's paper and Ferenczi's papers, where Ferenczi is talking about treating the soldiers. And Freud, of course, is speaking much more philosophically. And you already see differences about Ferenczi saying there's a trauma hysteria unique to this.
This would demand a far too long answer. I'm afraid we will have to, perhaps we can discuss this after Raluca's thought, but to make it really short, I would say the bioanalytical project actually remains something that Freud refers to positively even after Ferenczi's death. So despite everything, they had something there. And regarding war trauma, Ferenczi also spoke from within neuropsychiatry in uniform as a military psychiatrist. And he goes into a very close battle with the neuropsychiatric discourses of his time, which Freud can avoid and stay away from. And Ferenczi tries the impossible. I've also been analyzing these. That would be a different talk. Yeah. But it is very, very troubling and fascinating and intriguing what Ferenczi does in this situation. Yeah. But I agree that... I agree. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, okay.
All right. Thank you very much for this talk and discussion. And yeah, please join me in...